The HOA community of Brookridge Estates had always been the kind of place where everything looked carefully maintained. Lawns were trimmed to exact height, mailboxes aligned like soldiers, and even the trees seemed evenly spaced by design rather than nature. It was the kind of neighborhood where silence was considered a feature, not an absence. That quiet order shifted the day a new resident moved in. Her name was Selena Vance, a rising social media influencer known for luxury lifestyle content, dramatic home transformations, and carefully staged day-in-the-life videos. She arrived with a moving truck, a small camera crew, and a constant presence of ring lights and selfie sticks. To her, Brookridge Estates was not just a home, it was content. At first, the neighbors were cautiously welcoming. Selena introduced herself at the HOA Welcome Committee meeting with a polished smile and an energetic tone that filled the room. She spoke about community engagement, aesthetic harmony, and how excited she was to bring positive visibility to the neighborhood. Some residents even found her refreshing compared to the usual quiet, reserved newcomers. But there was one resident she did not warm up to. Next door lived Daniel Mercer, a retired military veteran who had moved into Brookridge Estates seeking peace after years of service overseas. Daniel was quiet, private, and rarely seen outside except in the early mornings or late evenings. By his side was Max, a trained service dog who assisted him with mobility and anxiety support. Max was calm, disciplined, and well-trained, never barking without reason, never wandering onto other properties. To Daniel, Max was not just a companion but an essential part of his daily life. But to Selena, Max became an unexpected problem. It started subtly. During one of her backyard filming sessions, Selena paused mid-recording, visibly annoyed by the sight of Max resting on Daniel's porch. "That dog is constantly in frame," she muttered to her assistant. "It ruins the aesthetic of the background." Her assistant laughed it off, assuming she was joking, but Selena was. Within days, she began mentioning the dog in her HOA feedback emails. She claimed the animal disrupted visual uniformity, lowered property appeal, and interfered with content production angles. At first, the HOA board dismissed her concerns as overly dramatic. Service animals were protected, and Daniel's dog had never caused an issue. Still, Selena persisted. She began subtly escalating her complaints, attending HOA meetings more frequently and steering discussions toward visual standards enforcement. She never directly attacked Daniel at first, but her language slowly sharpened. "There should be clearer guidelines about animals being visible from shared sightlines," she said during one meeting, her tone calm but firm. Daniel, who attended only when necessary, remained silent throughout. He had no interest in conflict. His focus was healing, stability, and maintaining routine. Max stayed close to him at all times, quietly observant. But Selena interpreted his silence differently. To her, it felt like indifference, or worse, defiance. Over time, her social media content began subtly referencing her frustrations. Without naming Daniel, she posted clips about inconsiderate neighbors, aesthetic disruptions, and people who don't respect shared living spaces. Her followers engaged heavily, assuming she was dealing with typical neighborhood drama. The comments encouraged her to stand her ground and protect her space. Encouraged by the attention, Selena's behavior grew more assertive. She began taking photos from her upstairs window, documenting what she called HOA violations, even though most of the images showed nothing more than Daniel sitting quietly with Max on his own property. She submitted repeated formal complaints, each more detailed than the last. The HOA board grew increasingly uncomfortable. While they appreciated Selena's enthusiasm for community involvement, they also recognized that Daniel had not violated any rules. Tension began forming quietly within board discussions, some members leaning toward accommodating Selena's demands, others defending Daniel's right to peace. Meanwhile, Daniel noticed the change but chose not to engage. He had seen conflict before in much harsher environments. A demanding neighbor was not something he considered worth escalating. Max, however, seemed more alert than usual whenever Selena was outside filming. The dog would watch her carefully from a distance, calm but attentive. Still, nothing had crossed the line yet. What the neighborhood did not realize was that this was only the beginning of a slow-building conflict. Beneath the surface of curated videos, polite HOA emails, and quiet porch mornings, tension was gathering like pressure beneath glass. And in Brookridge Estates, where appearances mattered more than anything else, even the smallest irritation could eventually become a breaking point. Selina had not yet realized it, but her need for control was beginning to clash with something far stronger than online attention or HOA rules. A man who had spent years in situations where real consequences existed, and who had learned patience in a way she had never needed to understand. The balance of the neighborhood was already shifting, and neither of them knew how far it would go. The tension in Brookridge Estates didn't explode overnight. It tightened slowly, like a wire being pulled a little more each day until it was impossible to ignore. Selina Vance had begun to treat the neighborhood not as a home, but as a controlled environment for her brand. Every morning, she adjusted angles, lighting, and background activity before filming. Every detail mattered. A leaf out of place, a car parked slightly off alignment, even distant sounds from neighbors could disrupt her recordings. And increasingly, one thing kept disrupting her focus: Daniel Mercer and his service dog, Max. It started with small complaints, the kind that could still be dismissed as personal preference. Then it escalated into formal HOA submissions. Selina argued that the visibility of a large animal near property lines reduced visual consistency, especially during her outdoor content shoots. She suggested restricted zones for pet activity and even proposed designated quiet hours for filming purposes. Most of the HOA board members were uneasy with the direction she was pushing things. At one meeting, Mr. Collins, an older board member known for his patience, finally spoke up. "Ms. Vance," he said carefully, "Mr. Mercer is within his rights. His service dog is medically necessary." Selina didn't react immediately. She simply smiled, the kind of controlled expression she often used in videos. "I understand that," she replied smoothly, "but I'm talking about community standards. We're all trying to maintain property value and aesthetic appeal." There was a brief silence in the room. Daniel Mercer, sitting at the far end of the table, finally spoke for the first time. "My dog doesn't leave my property. He doesn't interfere with anyone," he said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Years of discipline had taught him that unnecessary emotion only clouded clarity. Selina turned slightly toward him. "I'm not saying he's a bad dog," she said, tilting her head. "I'm saying visibility matters. Everything is part of the environment here." Max, who had been lying calmly by Daniel's feet during the meeting, lifted his head and looked directly at her. The dog was still but alert, trained to observe rather than react. The meeting ended without resolution. But something had shifted. After that night, Selina's tone changed. She stopped pretending neutrality in her online content. Her videos began featuring more pointed commentary. She spoke about neighbors who don't respect shared luxury spaces and people who refuse to adapt to modern community expectations. Her followers responded enthusiastically. Engagement increased, so did validation. What Selina didn't realize was that attention was reinforcing escalation rather than resolution. Meanwhile, Daniel remained unchanged in behavior but not in awareness. He noticed small things: Selina's camera pointed slightly longer toward his yard, HOA notices arriving more frequently, subtle shifts in how neighbors greeted him. He did not complain. Instead, he adjusted his routine slightly, walking Max during earlier hours and staying indoors more often during Selina's filming sessions. Max, however, became more observant. The dog had been trained for service but also for threat recognition. He did not bark or act aggressively, but his attention lingered longer on Selina's movements whenever she was outside. One afternoon, a minor incident occurred that escalated everything. Selina was filming near the shared property boundary, adjusting her camera for a wide-angle shot of her backyard setup. Daniel was seated quietly on his porch, reading, with Max lying beside him. Selina stopped mid-recording. "Can you move slightly?" she called out, her tone sharp but performative. "You're in my background again." Daniel looked up, confused. "I'm on my property," he said calmly. "I know," she replied, forcing a smile for her camera, "but you're in the shot." For a moment, neither moved. Then Daniel returned to his book. That was it. No argument, no escalation, just silence. But for Selena, it felt like defiance. Later that evening, she submitted another formal complaint to the HOA, this time more detailed and more urgent. She described repeated obstruction of content creation space and lack of cooperation from neighboring property. The HOA board was visibly frustrated now. Some members privately discussed whether Selena's behavior was becoming disruptive to the community itself. But what worried them most was that Daniel had not once retaliated or complained. He remained steady, which made Selena's persistence appear increasingly disproportionate. That night, something changed in Selena's behavior. Her assistant later mentioned that she stayed up late, reviewing footage repeatedly, zooming in on Daniel's property, rewatching moments that seemed insignificant to others. Her focus wasn't on content anymore, it was fixation. And when Max briefly appeared in one of her clips again the next morning, Selena didn't just pause recording. She stared long enough for her assistant to ask if something was wrong. Selena simply replied, "He shouldn't be there that much." The assistant didn't ask what she meant. But the air around Selena had shifted. What began as a quest for aesthetic control was beginning to blur into something far more personal. And in Brookridge Estates, where everything had always been controlled, quiet, and predictable, that kind of fixation rarely stayed contained for long. By the time the situation reached its breaking point, Brookridge Estates no longer felt like a peaceful residential community. It felt tense, like everyone was waiting for something to happen, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. Selena Vance had stopped framing her conflict as simple neighborhood disagreement. In her mind, she was now dealing with what she believed was deliberate noncompliance from Daniel Mercer. Every small interaction, every moment Max appeared in her background footage, every refusal to adjust behavior to her expectations, she interpreted it as resistance. What had once been annoyance had slowly hardened into fixation. Daniel, on the other hand, continued his routine unchanged. He did not respond to complaints. He did not engage in arguments. His life revolved around recovery, structure, and maintaining calm stability. Max remained his constant companion, moving with quiet precision beside him at all times. But something began to change one afternoon. It started subtly. Max, usually alert but steady, began showing signs of discomfort after returning from their routine walk. At first, Daniel thought it was fatigue or mild digestive upset. The dog had always been resilient, trained for endurance under stress. But within hours, it became clear something was wrong. Max refused food. His movement slowed. He remained close to Daniel, but his usual calm responsiveness was replaced by restlessness and unease. Daniel's instincts, sharpened from years of reading situations under pressure, immediately shifted into concern. Without hesitation, he gathered Max and prepared to leave for veterinary care. There was no anger yet, only urgency. Meanwhile, across the street, Selena was filming. She didn't notice the commotion at first. Her focus was on adjusting lighting for an outdoor segment about luxury home environments and personal boundaries. Her assistant was holding a stabilizer, following her instructions as she spoke to the camera. But as Daniel rushed out with Max in his arms, passing through the edge of her frame, Selena paused. Her expression tightened slightly. "Did you get that?" she asked her assistant, lowering her voice. "Yeah," the assistant replied cautiously. He looked like he was in a hurry. Selena frowned. Then she resumed filming as if nothing had happened. Later that evening, whispers began circulating through the neighborhood. Something was wrong with Max. No one had details yet, but in a community as tightly observed as Brookridge Estates, even partial information traveled quickly. Residents who had previously stayed neutral now began watching more closely. Daniel spent the night at an emergency veterinary clinic. The diagnosis was unclear at first. The symptoms suggested ingestion of something harmful, but the source was uncertain. The veterinary staff asked careful questions about exposure, walk routes, environment, possible contact points. Daniel answered everything with calm precision. Nothing unusual, no new foods, no changes in routine, only the familiar paths around his property and the immediate neighborhood. When he returned home the next morning, Max was still weak but stable. Daniel carried him gently inside. That should have been the end of it, a medical incident, unfortunate but explainable. But Selena's behavior changed immediately after hearing about it. She didn't express concern publicly. Instead, she began reviewing her own footage from the past few days. She zoomed in on clips of Daniel's movements, Max's position near property lines, even background moments she had previously ignored. Her assistant noticed her growing agitation. "It's probably just something he ate," the assistant suggested carefully. "Dogs get sick sometimes." Selena didn't respond right away. Instead, she rewound a clip again. And again. Finally, she said quietly, "It didn't happen randomly." The assistant hesitated. "What do you mean?" Selena closed her laptop slightly. "I mean, things don't just happen in patterns like that," she said, "not in a controlled environment." Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried something sharper than before, less frustration, more certainty. Across the neighborhood, concern began to shift into suspicion. Some residents recalled Selena's repeated complaints about Max. Others remembered her frustration during HOA meetings. A few even mentioned seeing her near shared property lines during filming sessions. Nothing was confirmed, nothing was proven. But perception was changing. The HOA board called an emergency review meeting, urging calm while quietly trying to understand what had happened. Daniel attended briefly, answering questions with the same controlled composure as always. He did not accuse anyone. He did not speculate. His focus remained entirely on Max's recovery. But his silence was no longer interpreted as indifference. It was now interpreted as restraint. And restraint, in moments like this, often made people more uneasy than anger. Selena, meanwhile, felt the atmosphere tightening around her. Neighbors no longer greeted her the same way. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Her presence in community discussions felt increasingly unwelcome. For the first time since moving into Brookridge Estates, she was not the one controlling the narrative. And yet she still did not step back. Instead, she doubled down, convinced that something deliberate was being framed against her, convinced that she was being unfairly associated with events she believed she did not cause. What she failed to realize was that the community was no longer focused on interpretation. They were focused on consequence. And in the background of all of it, Max slowly began to recover, becoming not just a point of concern, but a symbol of something larger taking shape in a neighborhood that had finally stopped pretending nothing was wrong. By the fourth day, Brookridge Estates no longer felt like a quiet HOA community trying to maintain order. It felt like a place under silent investigation, where everyone was watching everyone else, and even casual conversations carried the weight of suspicion. Max's condition had improved slightly, but he was still not fully himself. The veterinarians could not pinpoint the exact cause with certainty. They described it as a possible exposure to an unknown contaminant, carefully avoiding stronger language without evidence. That uncertainty, however, did little to calm anyone. In communities like Brookridge Estates, uncertainty rarely leads to patience. It leads to interpretation. And interpretation leads to stories. Selena Vance was now at the center of most of them. It didn't begin with accusations, it began with observation. A neighbor mentioned seeing Selena near the shared boundary fence at an unusual time the day before Max fell ill. Another recalled how she had been filming in that direction for an extended period, despite claiming earlier that Daniel's property was not suitable for content framing. None of this proved anything, but in a community where details were everything, even small inconsistencies began to feel heavy. The HOA board held a closed-door emergency discussion. The atmosphere was tense, not because anyone was ready to make accusations, but because they could no longer ignore the pattern forming around Selina's behavior. Mr. Collins, usually the most patient voice in the room, finally spoke with hesitation. "We need to be careful," he said, "but we also can't pretend there isn't a sequence of events here that needs clarity." Selina attended the meeting again, but her demeanor had changed. She was no longer performing confidence. Instead, she appeared controlled, measured, defensive in subtle ways that weren't immediately verbal. When asked about her movements during the relevant time frame, she responded smoothly. "I was filming my content," she said. "As I always do, I don't track other people's routines." Her tone was calm, but her pauses were slightly longer than before. Daniel Mercer, sitting across the room, did not speak unless addressed directly. When he was asked if he had any suspicion or accusation, he simply replied, "I'm focused on my dog's recovery." That answer, while restrained, carried more impact than anything else said in the room. Because it confirmed something important, Daniel was not escalating the situation emotionally. But others around him were. Outside the HOA meetings, the neighborhood dynamic had shifted dramatically. Small groups formed in driveways and sidewalks, discussing theories in low voices. Some residents defended Selina, pointing out the lack of concrete proof. Others were less forgiving, citing her previous complaints and increasingly aggressive behavior toward Daniel and Max. Social media made it worse. Unrelated clips from Selina's own content began circulating locally, older videos where she spoke about removing distractions from shared environments and maintaining control over visual spaces. In isolation, they were harmless influencer language, but in the current context, people began viewing them differently. Selina noticed the change almost immediately. Her engagement dropped slightly, but more importantly, the tone of her comments shifted. Followers asked uncomfortable questions. Some accused her indirectly. Others demanded explanations she wasn't prepared to give. Her assistant suggested taking a break from posting. Selina refused. "If I stop posting," she said firmly, "it looks like I'm hiding something." But even as she continued uploading content, her usual energy was gone. Her videos became shorter, more rigid. The smiles felt forced, the commentary less natural. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed largely out of sight, focusing on Max's recovery. The dog was improving slowly, regaining appetite and mobility, but still required close monitoring. Daniel rarely left his home except for necessary care routines. But the neighborhood no longer saw him as simply a quiet veteran neighbor. He was now seen as the center of a growing conflict. One evening, a resident shared a doorbell camera clip in a neighborhood group chat. It showed Selina walking near the shared boundary line late at night, pausing briefly before turning back toward her home. The footage was grainy, unclear, and open to interpretation, but it added fuel to already active speculation. Selina's response came quickly. She posted a statement online. It was carefully worded, avoiding direct denial or admission. She emphasized privacy, harassment concerns, and misrepresentation of normal activity. Her followers rallied in support, but locally, it did little to change the atmosphere. By now, perception had hardened. Even without proof, trust had eroded. The HOA board, feeling pressure from multiple sides, decided to request a formal review of all recent complaints and interactions. They emphasized neutrality, but it was clear the situation had moved beyond routine neighborhood disputes. Selina was becoming increasingly isolated within the community she once tried to influence. And isolation in Brookridge Estates was not something people adapted to easily. It was something they reacted to. Daniel remained consistent throughout all of it, quiet, composed, focused entirely on Max. But the contrast between his restraint and Selina's growing instability in public perception was becoming more pronounced with each passing day. What had started as a disagreement over aesthetics and HOA rules had now evolved into something far more fragile, a neighborhood divided by suspicion, interpretation, and unresolved tension. And in that environment, even silence no longer felt neutral. It felt like pressure building towards something that had not yet decided how it would break. By the fifth day, Brookridge Estates was no longer functioning like a normal HOA community. Meetings were no longer about landscaping rules or parking compliance. Every conversation had quietly shifted toward one question that no one wanted to say too directly. What really happened to Max? The uncertainty had created a fracture in the neighborhood. People who had once casually exchanged greetings now avoided eye contact. Small groups formed and dissolved quickly, each one discussing the same situation from slightly different angles, as if repeating it enough times might produce clarity. The HOA board was under increasing pressure to restore order, but order had already slipped beyond administrative control. Selena Vance felt that shift most sharply. She noticed it in the way neighbors stopped lingering when she walked outside, in how conversations cut off mid-sentence when she approached, in how her usual presence, once welcomed as vibrant and modern, now felt like an intrusion into spaces that were quietly closing off around her. Her online world wasn't offering relief either. Her engagement had not collapsed completely, but it had become unpredictable. Supportive comments were now mixed with skepticism. Some followers defended her fiercely, but others began questioning inconsistencies in her timeline and tone. She tried to maintain her usual polished presentation, but something was off. Her delivery was tighter, less fluid, as if she were constantly aware of being watched. Her assistant noticed it first. "You're overthinking every frame," they said gently while reviewing footage. "It's showing." Selena didn't respond immediately. She stared at the screen for a moment longer than necessary, then closed the laptop. "I'm not overthinking," she said quietly. "I'm being careful." But careful was no longer how others perceived her. At an emergency HOA session, tensions finally broke through the surface. The room was full, more residents attending than usual. The atmosphere was heavier than before, not with noise, but with restraint. Everyone seemed to understand that whatever was said in this meeting would define the direction of the situation going forward. Mr. Collins opened the discussion carefully. "We are not here to assign blame," he began. "We are here to assess facts and determine whether any HOA boundaries or conduct standards were violated." But even as he spoke, it was clear that neutrality was becoming harder to maintain. One resident spoke up first. "I saw her filming near his property line multiple times that week," they said, referring to Selena. "It didn't feel accidental." Another followed. "She was very focused on him specifically, not just general content." Selena listened without interrupting. Her posture was controlled, but her hands rested tightly together in her lap. When she was finally given the floor, she responded in a measured tone. "I understand people are emotional," she said, "but I have never targeted anyone. I film my content, that's my job." Her voice was steady, but the phrasing felt rehearsed. Across the table, Daniel Mercer remained still. Max was not present, still resting at home under careful observation. Daniel's attention was not on the discussion itself, but on maintaining calm structure in the middle of it. When asked again if he suspected Selena of any wrongdoing, he gave the same answer as before. "I'm focused on my dog's recovery." But this time, something had changed in the room. It was no longer interpreted as avoidance. It was interpreted as restraint under pressure. Outside the HOA building, the situation was shifting in a different direction. A few local community pages had begun discussing the incident indirectly. No one had concrete proof of anything, but narratives were forming anyway, based on timing, behavior, and patterns rather than facts alone. Selena's professional life began feeling the impact. Two brand partners paused scheduled collaborations, citing ongoing public concern. No formal accusations were made, but the implication was enough. Her manager advised silence or at least minimal engagement until things settled. But things were not settling. They were tightening. Selena began spending more time indoors. Her filming schedule became inconsistent. The energy she once brought to her content, bright, confident, curated, was now replaced with something more rigid. Even her followers noticed the shift. "She seems different lately," one comment read. "Like she's stressed," said another. That word stressed circulated more than any accusation. Meanwhile, Daniel's focus never shifted. Max was improving gradually, regaining strength day by day. The recovery was slow but steady, and with each small improvement, Daniel's composure remained unchanged. He did not celebrate publicly. He did not engage in speculation. His world remained centered on care, routine, and stability. But within the neighborhood, perception had already hardened into separation. Selena was now viewed through the lens of suspicion. Daniel was viewed through the lens of endurance. And between them stood an HOA community trying and failing to hold itself together through procedural language that no longer matched emotional reality. By the end of the week, it was no longer just about what had happened to Max. It was about what people believed had happened. And belief, once established in a closed environment like Brookridge Estates, did not wait for certainty. It moved faster than it. By the sixth day, Brookridge Estates no longer resembled the orderly HOA community it once was. The lawns were still trimmed, the mailboxes still aligned, and the streets still quiet, but beneath that surface, the neighborhood had fundamentally changed. What used to be routine conversations about maintenance and compliance had been replaced with something far more volatile: judgment without consensus. No official verdict had been reached. No one had been formally accused or cleared. But in a community driven by perception, that no man's land of uncertainty had already decided everything in practice. Selena Vance had become isolated in a way she never anticipated. It wasn't loud rejection, it was subtle withdrawal. Neighbors who once waved now turned their attention elsewhere. Conversations stopped when she entered shared spaces. Even the HOA board, while maintaining procedural neutrality, interacted with her in a more formal, distant manner. She felt it everywhere. In the silence of her home. In the reduced engagement on her posts. In the way her assistant hesitated before speaking, choosing words more carefully than before. Selena tried to maintain control the only way she knew how, through content. But even that was slipping. Her latest video, meant to present a calm return to routine, felt forced. The lighting was perfect, the framing precise, but her energy was noticeably restrained. Her usual confidence had been replaced with something tighter, more cautious, as if she were aware that every expression might be analyzed beyond its intended meaning. "Just act normal," her assistant suggested softly from behind the camera. Selena forced a small smile. "I am normal," she replied. But the words didn't land the way she intended. Elsewhere in Brookridge Estates, Daniel Mercer was sitting quietly on his porch. Max lay beside him, still recovering but visibly stronger than before. The dog's breathing was steady, his posture relaxed again, though Daniel remained attentive to every small change in behavior. There was no celebration, no visible triumph. Only relief that things were stabilizing. The community around them, however, had already moved past uncertainty into consequence. Even without a formal HOA ruling, Selena's standing had effectively collapsed. Her brand partnerships, already paused, were now quietly terminated. No public statements were made, but the message was clear enough in the absence of renewal contracts and disappearing collaborations. Her online presence, once vibrant and growing, had flattened. She posted less frequently now. And when she did, the response was divided: supporters on one side, skeptics on the other, neither fully dominant but neither neutral. The pressure that had been building for days reached its peak not in a courtroom or board decision, but inside Selena's own home. That morning began like the others. She prepared for filming, adjusted her setup, and tried to maintain her usual routine. But her assistant noticed something immediately: her focus was unstable. She checked angles repeatedly, adjusted lighting unnecessarily, and paused mid-sentence more often than usual. "You don't have to push today," the assistant said carefully. Selena didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked toward the window for a long moment. "I need to fix this," she said quietly. But there was nothing specific left to fix. By midday, she stepped away from filming entirely. The assistant later described her as visibly overwhelmed, less composed, more withdrawn, as if the weight of the past several days had finally accumulated beyond control. She sat alone for a long stretch of time. No camera. No audience. No performance. Just silence. When she eventually stood, it was to leave the house briefly. She didn't announce where she was going. Neighbors later said she appeared unsteady, moving slowly as if her usual sense of direction had been disrupted. Within hours, emergency services were called to her residence. There was no dramatic scene, no public spectacle, only a sudden medical collapse attributed to extreme stress and acute physiological reaction under prolonged psychological pressure. She was transported for immediate care. The neighborhood reacted quietly. Not with celebration, not with relief, but with a kind of subdued finality, as though a long, unresolved tension had finally stopped escalating. No official statement connected events directly. No conclusions were formally drawn linking causes or assigning responsibility beyond medical reports. But in the minds of the community, the narrative had already taken shape long before any official documentation existed. Later that evening, Daniel sat outside again as the sun lowered behind Brookridge Estates. Max rested beside him, calm and recovering well enough to lift his head occasionally in recognition of familiar sounds. Daniel didn't speak much. He didn't need to. The neighborhood had already shifted back toward quiet, but it was not the same quiet as before. It was different now, heavier, more aware of itself. Selina's absence, temporary or otherwise, left a noticeable gap in the rhythm of the community. Not because of who she was alone, but because of what had unfolded around her presence. Over time, things would likely return to routine. HOA meetings would resume their normal topics. Lawns would be trimmed, rules enforced, and life would continue in its structured, predictable way. But something had permanently changed beneath that structure. People now looked more carefully at small conflicts, at patterns, at escalation, and at how quickly perception could shift when tension was left unresolved. Daniel watched Max settle more comfortably beside him and finally allowed himself a quiet breath of relief. No words were spoken. But in the stillness of Brookridge Estates, one thing was clear. The neighborhood had learned a lesson it would not forget anytime soon.